Staying in Contact. I'm London Mitchell. Each week, we take a few minutes to examine an issue in our community and introduce individuals working to address those issues. Admittedly, sometimes we get into the weeds, but hopefully, you'll leave each installment with some food for thought and maybe the inspiration to roll up your own sleeves and join an effort. In this installment, I'm chatting with Greg Coleridge from Move to Amend, a national grassroots organization working to amend the U.S. Constitution to abolish corporate personhood and get big money out of politics. And that would include major campaign finance reform. That term, Greg, corporate personhood, I'm thinking that it is really a new term for most of us.
Because we don't really learn about this in school or across the mainstream, quote unquote mainstream press, but only from places like this. It basically means the constitutional right that has been given by the Supreme Court to corporate entities to have many of the same First Amendment and other Bill of rights. So it's being deemed a legal person in the eyes of the court and society in a variety of ways.
Well, why is that such a bad thing?
Well, it's such a bad thing because initially and originally, the Bill of Rights, First Amendment, Fourth, Fifth, 14th Amendment, were intended solely and exclusively for human beings. And corporate entities were creations of the state by a charter or a license that was meant to define or authorize what a company could and could not do, and nothing more than that. When you give constitutional rights to companies, to entities that basically outlive us, right? They can live forever and they can be chameleons. They can be here today and in another country tomorrow. They're not bound or accountable to any place, to any people particularly. Then they have inordinate amounts of power that was not intended in the Constitution. There's no mention of corporations in the Constitution having constitutional rights. And it just preempts, it overwhelms the ability of people to exert their right. And so they have used these never intended constitutional rights to evade accountability, evade ability to be defined by we the people. And so we actually wrote a book about it a number of years ago. It's called Citizens Over Corporations, a brief history of democracy in Ohio and challenges to freedom in the future. And basically what this did is it tells the story of how we got into the fix that we were in, and it sort of goes back, very, very, very briefly. The revolution in this country wasn't just a revolution against the king. It was a revolution against the king's military arm, the redcoats, but also a revolution against the king's economic/political arm. And those political/economic arms were called crown corporations. They were given to a small number of people the power to incorporate, to form a company. And that company then could do only what the king permitted it to do, nothing more than that. And they were, running roughshod over the colonists, not just economically like a business, we'd think a business would do, but they were governing, they were taxing, they were drafting. And the colonists didn't like to be controlled by the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Virginia Company, the Baltimore Company, etc.
Wow, this corporation has a tremendous amount of power because it has a tremendous amount of money.
That's right. And they converted that economic power. It was after the Civil War. So originally, after the Revolution, they constitutionalized these crown corporations. So the Massachusetts Bay Company became the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so now these individuals who were governing, that were accountable to the King of England, now are, at least on paper, accountable to we the people, at least those who could vote at that time. And so that's an example of how that private power was democratized. But of course, over time, and particularly following the Civil War, where in general, how it works is all wars throughout history, companies gain power, and they tried to translate that economic power into political power. And so it was after the Civil War that these companies began saying, we don't like to be controlled by, we the people in Ohio and other places, because it was at the state level. Remember, early on in this country, the founders really didn't trust the federal government as much as the state. So they invested the authority to charter or to license companies at the state level. And so it was at the state level where companies were licensed one at a time, and they were not given rights but privileges. Hey, you want to build a canal? Fine. We'll give you, X number of years to do it. You can charge a private, like a toll once the canal is built. But after like 20 years, that private canal becomes public because it should be, you've made a profit. You built that. We couldn't do it, the public, but we now want to democratize it. And so companies didn't like this sort of control of being told what to do. They wanted to do the telling. And so that's when they shifted or tried to, and in a variety of ways were successful at shifting the power of who runs whom, who defines whom, who's subordinate and who's in charge. They switched on its head. And that's how they did it was they went to the Supreme Court. Well, they did a variety of ways. One is they escaped. They said, we don't like to be told by Ohio, legislature who defined us what we're doing. We're going to take off for New Jersey, which, today, more than half of the Fortune 500 companies are chartered in Delaware. Well, then it was New Jersey. And so Standard Oil of Ohio, for example, hey, right in our state, the biggest, baddest, most powerful corporation on the planet at that time was chartered in Ohio, meaning they could only do what the state legislature in the charter said they could do. They didn't like that. And so they tried to sue the state of Ohio. And it was actually two Republican, it's in the book, two Republican attorney generals went to court and tried to yank the charter put Standard Oil Corporation out of business because they said, you're too big for your britches. They were trying to form a trust. And no, we gave you a charter to be a single company, not to be a conglomerate that would be too powerful, both economically and to translate that economic power, campaign contributions being a good one, into political power. And so, they didn't like that, so they took off and rechartered in Pennsylvania. So that was one of the ways they escaped. But one of the others is they ran away from the state defining things to the Supreme Court. Because when you shift defining from the state legislature to the Supreme Court, you know what that does? It's metaphorically the equivalent of, a person playing a game and when you're doing the defining, you're a player on the field, right? When you now shift decision making from the legislative arena, where you have some kind of power, at least indirect, to elect representatives who are chartering companies, to the Supreme Court, you're no longer on the field. You're now in the stands, booing and hissing. But the real definers, the real people who are authorizing what cannot do what companies cannot do, are these 9 justices on the Supreme Court. That's it. So we've lost our power to define and to be sort of the authorizers of what companies can do when we shifted it to the Supreme Court, and they define companies as persons, which began in the 1880s. We can boo, we can hiss, we can cheer, whatever the case may be, but we're not the definers anymore. We're not the deciders. We're not doing democracy, sovereignty, self-determination as was intended.
Is there any way to pull them back, to hold them as accountable as we hold our neighbors?
Yeah. And there's a really famous Ohio case of, my favorite anyway, quote, of revoking a corporate charter in which the Supreme Court said the time has not yet arrived when the created is greater than the creator. And it still remains the duty of the courts to perform their office in the enforcement of the law, no matter how powerful the entity may be in the commercial world. I mean, that's powerful stuff. That's self-governing stuff. That's language of people who understand their relationship to these creations, to these legal to a piece of paper. That's what a corporation is. It's a piece of paper that gives a group of people a shield that if they get sued, they won't lose their personal wealth. The wealth of the company may be at risk, but not their personal. That's the veil. The corporate veil is what they call it. And so, people can come together and do any business they want. They don't have to have a corporate license. But if they want that license, then they've got to abide by the terms. Okay. If you want something for, this, well, what's the terms for it? What's my responsibility? Because otherwise, they're not responsible. And if, you and I are responsible, if we break the law, we have to suffer for it. But companies now, they're getting away with everything because hey, they're a person, they have a First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment right to do this, they claim. And so, when anybody is not accountable, I mean, you run roughshod. I mean, you're just not being a a positive contributor to society. And so that's what companies have become.
It would seem that this is a real David versus Goliath kind of thing. What can Joe average person do if they have some real concerns or they want to bring these corporate personhoods into some kind of control?
Yeah. Well, that's where the organization Move to Amend is trying to weigh in and provide an alternative to companies having this never intended right to do what they want, when they want, where they want. We have Move to Amend has proposed what's called the We the People Amendment. And so the We the People Amendment introduced now, this is like the fifth or sixth time it's been introduced in Congress. This session of Congress is called, it's numbered HJR 54. And it's been introduced by Pramila Jayapal, representative from the state of Washington, who really believes strongly that, as the amendment says, there's two provisions of it. The first says that only human beings should have inalienable constitutional rights. And second, that money should not be defined as speech. In the Toledo area and at a community level, the City Council of Toledo wanted to pass a law saying, hey, we want to give preferential treatment to local businesses because we think local businesses are important, right? They're owned by local people in the community who pay taxes, who are accountable to their neighbors, to not just customers, but to their neighbors. Their customers are often their neighbors. And, local businesses are having a tough time these days. So we want to give like a preferential tax break to a local business versus a chain store. You can't do that. Why? Because the local chain, the chain store that's come in from that's headquartered in, I don't know, Walmart in Arkansas or some other company somewhere else can claim you are violating, City Council of Toledo, our 14th Amendment constitutional rights. 14th Amendment was passed originally to give newly freed Black enslaved human beings the right, many rights, but including due process and equal protection. So they will say, you are discriminating against us. You are providing unequal protection to us by saying we can't have the same privilege, we can't have the same perk, we can't have the same tax break that you were providing. So that hamstrings what a city council can do who may want to give preferential treatment to local businesses. That's one of many, many, many examples of how corporate entities have used and have bludgeoned the local ability to self-define, we the people to rule ourselves, that goes beyond money is free speech. So the We the People Amendment not only addresses ending corporate constitutional rights, but all of money is speech, but all never intended. They go back to the 1880s.
Greg Coleridge is with the grassroots group Move to Amend. Greg, some really insightful information. Again, for more information about the We the People Amendment, check out the website movetoamend.org. I'm London Mitchell. You can contact me through my webpage, londonmitchell.news. And please join us again next week as we continue staying in contact.
Previous installments of Staying in Contact with London Mitchell are available on Amazon Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Podbeam, Podchaser, the Stream 419 app, and londonmitchell.news.